The unexpected arrival. The stars above the distant planet of Vorta III twinkled like diamonds in the vastness of space. On this planet, deep in the heart of the galaxy, lived an alien scientist named Zorath. Zorath was well known across several star systems. His intelligence was unmatched, and his passion for discovering the unknown had led him to study life forms from countless planets. But there was one species he found particularly fascinating: humans. Humans were unlike any other species he had encountered. They were unpredictable, emotional, and yet incredibly resilient. Zorath had studied humans from afar, watching their rise and fall, their wars and peace, their science and art. He had always wondered how such a young species could hold so much promise and potential. Zorath's laboratory was a huge structure filled with strange devices and glowing lights. It was here, in the quiet solitude of his research, that Zorath spent most of his time. But today, something unusual was about to happen. Zorath had been working on a project that required a great deal of focus. He was trying to unlock the secrets of a mysterious alien artifact that had been discovered near the edge of the galaxy. The artifact was ancient, its origin unknown. For weeks, Zorath had been studying it, hoping to find something that could reveal more about the universe. But while he was deep in his work, an unexpected signal flashed across his communication screen. It was a distress signal, a small spacecraft stranded in the void of space. The ship was barely holding together, its systems failing, and the life signs of its crew were fading fast. Zorath's curiosity got the best of him. He immediately accessed the coordinates and set his ship on course. He couldn't ignore a distress signal, especially one that came from a species he had always been so intrigued by. The journey to the spacecraft took several hours, but Zorath finally arrived. The small ship was drifting, its lights flickering weakly. As Zorath approached, he saw the damaged vessel in greater detail. It was clearly a human ship. The design was familiar, old, yet still functioning despite the damage. Zorath carefully docked his own ship to the derelict craft. The airlock opened, and Zorath stepped inside. He was cautious, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The ship was in disarray, debris scattered across the floor. But as Zorath ventured deeper into the ship, he heard something. Soft, quiet cries. He followed the sound and found a small human child, curled up in a corner of the ship. The child was no older than 5, with blonde hair and wide, frightened eyes. The child's clothes were torn, and they appeared weak, dehydrated from the lack of proper care. Zorath's heart, though alien, felt a strange tug. This was not just a human, it was a child. Zorath had never encountered a human child before, and something in their innocent eyes sparked a deep curiosity within him. He knelt beside the child, speaking in a calm, soothing voice. "Do not be afraid. I will help you." The child looked up at him, unsure of what to make of this strange alien. They had no way of knowing that Zorath had no ill intentions. They only saw a tall, imposing figure with glowing blue skin and glowing silver eyes, unlike any creature they had ever seen. Zorath knew the child was too weak to survive on their own. The ship's life support systems were failing, and the child needed immediate medical attention. Without hesitation, Zorath lifted the child carefully into his arms and carried them to his own ship. Once aboard, Zorath immediately activated his medical systems. He was skilled in alien biology, but humans were still a mystery to him in many ways. However, he was determined to help the child. The healing process was slow but steady. Zorath used a variety of alien medical tools to stabilize the child's condition. Slowly, the color returned to the child's face, and their breathing became more regular. Hours passed before the child finally awoke. Their eyes fluttered open, and they stared up at Zorath in confusion. The child's voice, though weak, trembled as they asked, "Who are you?" Zorath smiled softly. "I am Zorath, an explorer. And you, little one, are safe now." The child didn't say anything at first, unsure of whether they could trust this alien. But over time, Zorath's calming presence put them at ease. He promised the child that they would be taken to a safe place, far from the dangers of space. Zorath knew that this was the beginning of something he had never imagined. He had saved a human child, and that was not a small act. The child, now under his care, would change everything. Zorath had read about human potential, their ability to adapt and grow in the most difficult circumstances, but he never thought he would be the one to witness it firsthand. As the child grew stronger, Zorath found himself teaching them the ways of the universe. He shared his knowledge of the stars, of planets and species far beyond their own. And as the child learned, Zorath saw something that filled him with wonder. The child was learning faster than he ever expected. Zorath had adopted this child, but he did not realize that by doing so, he had unknowingly set into motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundations of the galaxy. This child, this innocent human, was destined for more than just survival. They would play a central role in an intergalactic conflict that would change the galaxy forever. But for now, Zorath could only focus on one thing: keeping this child safe. They were his responsibility now, and he would protect them at all costs. The galaxy was vast, but Zorath knew that with the child by his side, anything was possible. The universe was full of mysteries, and he was eager to unravel them all, starting with the mysterious human child who had arrived in his life so unexpectedly. Little did he know, this child would soon be the key to unlocking something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The awakening of a hidden power. Zorath's ship, a sleek and quiet vessel, drifted through the vast emptiness of space. The child, Kel, was beginning to recover, but Zorath could tell something was different. He had spent years studying many species across the galaxy, but this child was unlike anything he had encountered before. Humans were fragile and vulnerable, but Kel had an inner strength that Zorath couldn't ignore. Over the following weeks, Zorath gave Kel all the care and attention he could. He carefully monitored Kel's health, ensuring the child regained their strength. The ship's medical technology worked wonders, and Kel's condition improved daily. The child's curiosity about the universe began to shine through, and they often asked Zorath countless questions about the stars, planets, and other species. Zorath answered each one with patience, happy to share his knowledge. One evening, as Zorath was working in his lab, Kel approached him, holding a strange, glowing object they had found in the ship's storage room. It was a small, ancient-looking crystal, pulsing with a soft blue light. The crystal wasn't familiar to Zorath, and he instinctively felt a surge of unease. He had never seen anything quite like it. "Zorath, what is this?" Kel asked, holding the crystal up to the light. Zorath took the crystal gently from Kel's hands. "That is something I have never seen before," he replied, his voice tinged with curiosity. "It must be ancient. Perhaps it holds the key to something far greater than we understand." He examined the crystal carefully, his mind racing. It seemed to resonate with a strange energy that he couldn't quite place. Zorath had studied energy sources from across the galaxy, but this crystal felt different. It was as if the crystal had its own pulse, responding to something deep inside Kel. Without warning, the crystal began to glow brighter as Kel held it in their hands. Zorath stepped back, alarmed. He could feel the energy in the air shift, and the walls of the ship seemed to hum with power. Kel looked up at Zorath, eyes wide with confusion and awe. They had never seen anything like this before, but it felt right. The crystal felt like a part of them. Zorath quickly reached for the control panel in his lab, attempting to analyze the crystal's energy. As he typed in commands, he noticed something strange. The crystal's energy seemed to be affecting the ship's systems. The lights flickered, and a low rumble filled the air as the ship's engines briefly shut down. "What is happening?" Zorath muttered, his concern growing. He hadn't expected the crystal to have such an effect. His calculations didn't make sense. Kel's voice broke through his thoughts. "Zorath, what's wrong?" Zorath turned to face the child. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But whatever this crystal is, it's affecting more than just the ship." Just as Zorath finished speaking, the crystal in Cal's hands flared with energy. The glow intensified until the ship was bathed in a bright, blinding light. Zorath shielded his eyes, feeling the wave of energy wash over him. The power was immense, but it was also chaotic. The energy seemed to be pulling on something deeper inside Cal, something even Zorath couldn't fully comprehend. Then, as quickly as it had started, the light vanished. The ship returned to normal, but the atmosphere felt different. The hum of the engines resumed, and the systems came back online. Zorath's mind raced as he processed what had just happened. He looked at Cal, who was holding the crystal with both hands, still in a daze. "What did you do?" Zorath asked, his voice a mix of awe and concern. Cal blinked, shaking their head. "I don't know. I didn't mean to. It just happened." Zorath could sense that Cal wasn't lying. The child hadn't intentionally activated the crystal's power, but something had awoken in Cal, something tied to the energy of the crystal. Zorath's thoughts turned dark. He knew this crystal was more than just an artifact. It was a key to something far greater, and Cal seemed to be the one unlocking its potential. The question now was, what had Cal just unleashed? And more importantly, why had this crystal chosen Cal? Zorath needed answers, but he didn't know where to begin. He had traveled across galaxies in search of knowledge, but this situation was different. He wasn't just dealing with an ancient artifact anymore. He was dealing with a human child who, by some strange twist of fate, had somehow become connected to this powerful crystal, and that connection had the potential to change everything. As the days passed, Zorath kept a careful eye on Cal, studying the child's every movement. He noticed subtle changes. Cal's thoughts seemed sharper, their curiosity more intense. There was a new kind of awareness in their eyes, something that suggested the child was beginning to understand more about the universe than Zorath had ever expected. The crystal had done something to Cal, something that was slowly becoming clearer. Zorath began to realize that Cal's presence, combined with the power of the crystal, had the potential to reshape the galaxy. The galaxy's oldest and most powerful civilizations had fought wars over energy sources, like the one Cal had accidentally activated. If the wrong people discovered the child's connection to the crystal, they would stop at nothing to control Cal and the power that lay within them. Zorath knew it was only a matter of time before the rest of the galaxy learned about the crystal's awakening, and with that knowledge, the danger would grow. Soon, the very fate of the galaxy could be in Cal's hands. Zorath had to keep them safe, but how could he protect a child from an entire galaxy of beings who would stop at nothing to seize the power they had just unlocked? The war had already begun, though neither Zorath nor Cal fully understood its scale, and as the child's powers grew, so too would the dangers they would face. The growing storm. Zorath had always been a strategist, a planner, but nothing in his vast knowledge of the galaxy had prepared him for what he now faced. Cal was more than just a human child. They were the key to something that could bring about an unimaginable change. Zorath knew the crystal was ancient, but what it could do, or what it was capable of, was still a mystery. The day after the energy surge in the ship, Zorath decided to isolate the crystal. He placed it in a secure containment chamber, hoping that by studying it further, he could unlock its secrets without exposing Cal to any more danger. But even as he secured the chamber, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The crystal's power had already begun to affect the child in ways that Zorath couldn't explain. Cal, on the other hand, felt different. Their curiosity had only deepened since the event. Though Zorath had tried to shelter Cal from the dangers of the crystal's power, the child had an insatiable need to understand it. They spent hours in the laboratory, sitting quietly as they tried to connect with the crystal, as if some hidden part of them already understood its significance. It was as if the child's bond with the crystal had only just begun, but Zorath could see that the connection was becoming stronger with each passing day. "Zorath," Kale said one morning, standing near the chamber where the crystal was locked away. I think I know what it wants. Zorath froze. He had never heard the child speak with such certainty. The innocence in Kal's voice had always been a comfort, but now there was something more, something deeper. Zorath turned to face the child, his mind racing. What do you mean, Kal? He asked cautiously. Kale looked up at him, their eyes filled with a kind of clarity that Zorath couldn't explain. The crystal. It's not just an artifact. It's alive, isn't it? It's calling to me. Zorath's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected that the crystal was more than just a dormant power source, but to hear Kale speak it aloud sent a chill down his spine. I don't know what you mean, Zorath said, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. The crystal is an object of unknown origin. There is no indication that it is anything more than a source of energy. Kale shook their head. No, Zorath, it's not just energy. It has a consciousness. I can feel it. I think it wants to be with me. Zorath looked at Kale with a mix of awe and concern. The child was right about one thing. The crystal seemed to react to Kale, and Zorath had witnessed it firsthand. But was it truly alive? Was the crystal sentient in some way, or was Kale simply imagining things? Before Zorath could respond, an alarm blared through the ship, pulling him from his thoughts. The monitors flickered, and the ship's AI systems scrambled to relay a message. Zorath's heart raced as he quickly approached the console. Warning: incoming transmission from an unknown vessel. Source unidentified. Communication channels opening. Zorath's pulse quickened. An unknown vessel. This was no ordinary event. He had been in deep space for weeks now, far from the center of any galactic hub. An unknown ship appearing at this exact moment could only mean one thing. Someone was aware of Kale and the crystal. With a tense expression, Zorath activated the transmission. The image of a cold, mechanical face appeared on the screen, an image he recognized all too well. It was a representative of the Zarnok Dominion, one of the most powerful and ruthless empires in the galaxy. You have something that belongs to us, the voice on the screen said, its tone sharp and demanding. Hand over the child, Zorath, and we may let you live. Zorath's breath caught in his chest. He knew the Zarnok Dominion. Their empire was vast, and their hunger for power knew no bounds. If they had found out about the crystal, it was only a matter of time before they came for Kale. No, Zorath said firmly. I do not know what you are talking about. There is nothing here that belongs to you. The Zarnok representative's face twisted into a cold smile. You are mistaken, scientist. We know exactly what you have. The child and the artifact are one and the same. We will stop at nothing to claim both. Zorath's mind raced. The Zarnok Dominion had been known to have access to advanced tracking technology, but how had they found him so quickly? And why were they after Kale and the crystal? Zorath had to act fast. I will not surrender, Kale, Zorath replied, his voice steady, but filled with resolve. Leave us in peace, or face the consequences. The transmission cut abruptly, and the screen went black. Zorath stood frozen, his mind processing the gravity of the situation. He had to protect Kale, but the Zarnok Dominion was no small threat. They had a reputation for destroying entire civilizations to obtain what they wanted. And now, they had their sights set on Kale and the crystal. Kale, who had been watching the exchange from the doorway, stepped forward. Zorath, who was that? Zorath turned to the child, his face hardened with determination. That was the Zarnok Dominion. They want the crystal. They want you. Kal's eyes widened in fear, but Zorath quickly knelt down to them, trying to calm the child. Listen to me. You are safe for now. I will protect you. Kale nodded, but the fear in their eyes was impossible to ignore. Zorath knew that this was only the beginning. The Zarnok Dominion was just one of many forces in the galaxy that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. And if Kale was to survive, They would need to uncover the true power of the crystal before the galaxy came crashing down on them. Zorath made a decision. They could no longer stay in hiding. It was time to find answers, to unlock the full potential of the crystal, and to prepare for the storm that was rapidly approaching. There was no turning back now. The war had begun, and Kale, the human child who had unknowingly sparked it, would have to face a galaxy it was now at war over their existence. The hunt begins. Zorath's mind raced as he paced through the command center of his ship. The Zarnok Dominion was not just a threat. They were a force of nature, one of the most feared and brutal empires in the galaxy. If they were coming for Kale, there was no telling how far they would go to get the crystal. Zorath knew they couldn't stay here much longer. Kale, standing near the observation window, looked out at the stars. Their expression was a mixture of fear and determination. It was clear they had overheard the conversation, and while the child tried to remain strong, Zorath could see the anxiety in their eyes. This was no longer just about surviving the unknown. This was about facing a galaxy that was now aware of Kal's connection to the powerful crystal. Zorath, Kale spoke softly, turning to face him. What do we do now? Zorath hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts. We need to leave this area. We can't afford to stay in the same place for long. The Zarnok Dominion will likely be sending more ships, and they won't stop until they have what they want. The child nodded, but Zorath could tell that Kale didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. The crystal inside them was not only an artifact of power, it was a catalyst for a war. The Zarnok Dominion, and countless other factions, would stop at nothing to seize it. Zorath quickly turned to the ship's navigation system and began plotting a course. We need to get to the outer rim. There are safe zones there, places the Dominion won't risk attacking. It's our best chance to stay off their radar. How long do we have? Kale asked, their voice tight with worry. We don't have much time, Zorath replied, his tone more serious than he intended. We need to move fast, or they'll track us down. You need to stay close to me, Kale. You're the most important person in this galaxy right now. Kale frowned, sensing the weight of his words. What do you mean? Zorath took a deep breath and looked the child in the eyes. The Zarnok Dominion, and others in the galaxy, know about the crystal now. They know it's connected to you. The power inside you could change the fate of this galaxy, and they'll do anything to control that power. Kale absorbed Zorath's words, their brow furrowing with confusion. But I don't even know how it works. I just touched it. Zorath placed a reassuring hand on Kal's shoulder. It's not about what you've done so far, Kale. The crystal is part of you now. It has awakened something inside you, something the galaxy will never understand. As Zorath activated the ship's engines and the vessel slowly lifted off from its hidden location, he felt a strange sensation. The ship was still under the influence of the crystal's energy, even though Kale wasn't holding it anymore. It was as if the crystal's pulse was guiding their path. The ship's acceleration was smooth, but Zorath could feel the tension in the air. His hands moved quickly over the console, adjusting course and monitoring the ship's systems. He had to make sure they were undetected, but it was difficult to predict how quickly the Zarnok would mobilize. Kale walked quietly beside him, still holding the crystal close to their chest. Zorath glanced over at the child, who was deep in thought. Zorath had no idea what Kale was feeling, but he could sense the child's inner turmoil. For the first time in his life, Zorath was unsure of how to protect someone who was more than just a child. Kale was tied to an ancient power, one that could either save the galaxy or tear it apart. As the ship moved deeper into the void of space, the stars outside the windows stretched into lines of light, a breathtaking display of the universe's endless expanse. Zorath couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. The galaxy was vast, filled with many different species, each with its own agenda. The Zarnok were just the beginning of the dangers Kale would face. If the Zarnok knew about the crystal, other, even more dangerous forces would find out soon enough. The only way to ensure Kel's safety was to unlock the full potential of the crystal. But Zoreth wasn't sure how. They had to find answers, and quickly. Time was running out. Days passed, and the ship traveled further toward the outer rim. Zoreth had managed to cover their tracks, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The Zarnok Dominion's network was vast, and their ability to track ships was unmatched. Every moment they spent in this part of space was one step closer to being discovered. Zoreth's mind returned to Kale. The child had changed since the incident with the crystal. It was subtle, but Zoreth could sense the difference. Kale had become more attuned to their surroundings, more perceptive. They had even begun asking more focused questions about the galaxy, about how things worked. It was as if Kale was beginning to understand more about the universe than Zoreth himself. One evening, Kale came to Zoreth with an unusual request. "Zoreth, I think I can feel the crystal again. It's calling to me, like it wants me to do something." Zoreth's heart skipped a beat. Could the child really sense it? He had to tread carefully now. The crystal's power wasn't something to be taken lightly, and Kel's connection to it could unlock even more danger than either of them realized. "Kel," Zoreth said, his voice steady but with an underlying tone of caution. "You have to be careful. This crystal is not like anything you've ever encountered. Its power is dangerous, and we still don't fully understand what it can do. Don't act on it yet, all right?" Kale nodded, though Zoreth could see the determination in the child's eyes. The desire to understand the crystal's purpose was growing within them, and Zoreth knew it wouldn't be long before Kel could no longer ignore it. But there was no more time to wait. The Zarnok were already on their trail. And soon, other factions would begin searching too. If Zoreth couldn't protect Kel from them, the galaxy would fall into chaos. The hunt for Kel had begun. And this time, there would be no turning back. The first strike. Zoreth's eyes never left the star charts. His mind raced with calculations, trying to predict the best route to the Outer Rim's sanctuary worlds. But he knew they were running out of time. The Zarnok Dominion was relentless, and their ships could appear out of nowhere. Zoreth had been in space long enough to know when a pursuit was inevitable, and this one was. The moment they left the safety of the asteroid field, they'd be visible to the wider galaxy, and with the Zarnok aware of their location, it was only a matter of time before they came. Kale sat quietly in the corner of the control room, their gaze fixed on the crystal that lay gently on the table. The faint glow that emanated from it seemed more intense now, as if it were responding to something deep inside the child. Zoreth had noticed this change, but he couldn't fully understand what it meant. The crystal was more than just an artifact. There was something else about it, something alive, perhaps, and Kale seemed to be the only one who could access its power. The ship suddenly jolted, and Zoreth grabbed the console to steady himself. Alarms blared, filling the space with a sound that was both urgent and ominous. "Zoreth," Kale shouted, their voice filled with fear. "What's happening?" Zoreth quickly punched in the commands to activate the ship's defensive shields. He turned toward Kale, his face grim. "They found us," he said, his voice low. "The Zarnok." Kale's eyes widened with panic. "How do they know where we are?" Zoreth didn't have time to explain. The Zarnok Dominion's advanced tracking systems could detect energy fluctuations in the area, and with the crystal emitting a strange, yet powerful signature, it had been a matter of time before the Dominion traced them. They had to act fast. The ship rocked again, this time harder. Zoreth's hands flew over the console, activating the weapon systems. He couldn't risk being caught in the open. If they were going to survive, they needed to fight back. A voice crackled through the ship's communication system. The Zarnok representative, cold and calculating, spoke from the other end. "Zoreth, you cannot escape us. Surrender the child and the crystal, and we will let you live. Resist, and we will destroy you." Zoreth's mind raced. He had known that the Zarnok would come for the child, but to hear their threat so directly made the gravity of the situation all too real. If he gave in, They would be captured, and the Zarnak would use Kale to gain control of the crystal's unimaginable power. If he resisted, they would die. It was a dire choice, but in Zoreth's mind, there was no question. He could never hand over Kale. "We will never surrender to you," Zoreth responded firmly. "We will fight." The transmission cut abruptly, and Zoreth slammed his hand on the controls, activating the ship's emergency thrusters to push the vessel into a rapid, evasive maneuver. The ship's speed surged, and the distant stars became streaks of light as the ship hurtled through the vacuum of space. Zoreth quickly scanned the surrounding area. There were no nearby planets or safe zones. They were alone in the void, with no allies to call on. The only option was to outmaneuver the incoming threat. "We need to stay one step ahead of them," Zoreth said, his voice tight with focus. "Prepare yourself, Kale. This is going to get rough." Kale nodded silently, their eyes still locked on the crystal. Zoreth could see the uncertainty in the child's face, but there was something else there, too, something that spoke of strength. Kale had no idea just how much power was inside them, but Zoreth was beginning to suspect that the crystal was more than just a tool. It was a key, and Kale was the one who could unlock it. The Zarnak fleet appeared on the ship's sensors, 3 massive warships closing in fast. The readings showed they were armed to the teeth, their weapons designed for one thing: destruction. Zoreth knew they would try to force them into a corner. He adjusted the ship's trajectory, weaving between asteroid fields and dangerous debris, hoping to lose them. But the Zarnak ships were relentless. They had caught up faster than Zoreth had anticipated. Suddenly, the ship's shields flickered under heavy fire. Sparks flew from the console, and the lights dimmed momentarily. The ship shook violently, throwing both Zoreth and Kale off balance. "Zoreth!" Kale cried, holding onto the seat for dear life. "We can't outrun them." Zoreth gritted his teeth. "We can, but we need to turn the tide." In a flash of inspiration, Zoreth initiated the ship's special maneuvering system, an experimental technology designed to create an unpredictable energy pulse capable of confusing enemy ships. The ship lurched, sending the Zarnak ships into disarray. For a moment, their weapons fire went off target, and the pursuit faltered. Zoreth seized the opportunity. "Kale, I need you to focus. The crystal, it's the key. You need to connect with it. Now." Kale looked confused, but desperation sparked in their eyes. "What do I do?" Zoreth felt the urgency of the moment. "Focus on the crystal, Kale. Focus on its power. It's not just an object. It's a living thing, and it's connected to you. You can control it. You need to connect with it now, before it's too late." Kale hesitated for a moment, then closed their eyes, clutching the crystal tightly to their chest. Zoreth watched, holding his breath. The ship's systems were failing, and the Zarnak ships were closing in again. It was a gamble, but Zoreth knew this was the only chance. The moment Kale touched the crystal, a sudden pulse of energy erupted from the ship, emanating from the child. The surrounding space seemed to distort, the stars warping as if reality itself were bending. The Zarnak ships suddenly found themselves out of sync, their targeting systems malfunctioning as if they were lost in a sea of static. The pulse intensified, and Zoreth's ship shot forward at an unbelievable speed, leaving the Zarnak ships in its wake. They had made it. For a few moments, silence reigned in the ship's control room. Zoreth looked over at Kale, who had collapsed into the seat, breathing heavily. They had done it. Kale had triggered the crystal's power. "We're safe, for now," Zoreth said, his voice shaking with relief. But as they drifted through the stars, Zoreth's mind remained focused on one thing. This battle was only the beginning. They had escaped the Zarnak dominion this time, but the war for the crystal was far from over. And Kale was at the center of it all. The hunt was far from finished. The hidden sanctuary. Zoreth's mind raced, even as the ship coasted through the silence of deep space. The Zarnak dominion had been thrown off their trail, but that only bought them a few precious hours. The universe was vast, but it was also filled with dangers, both known and unknown. And Kale was the key to a power that could shift the balance of the entire galaxy. He glanced over at the child, who was still recovering from the intense energy pulse they had unleashed. Cal's pale face showed signs of exhaustion, but their eyes held something new: determination. Zorath had seen it before, in the eyes of warriors facing impossible odds. Kale, despite their young age, was starting to understand the weight of their connection to the crystal. "Are you all right?" Zorath asked, trying to keep his voice calm, though he knew they were far from safe. Kale nodded, but the worry in their gaze betrayed them. I don't understand. What was that? I didn't know I could do that." Zorath sat down beside them, leaning against the ship's console as the stars continued to stretch out before them. "You didn't know because you're only beginning to realize the power that's inside you, Kale. The crystal, it's more than just a piece of ancient technology. It's part of you now. When you connected with it, you tapped into something that the galaxy has never seen." Cal's hands shook as they held the crystal. The faint glow from within pulsed in sync with their heartbeat. "But why me?" Kale whispered. "Why did it choose me?" Zorath sighed, his thoughts drifting back to the many questions that still haunted him. "I wish I could answer that, Kale. But I don't know. The crystal's origins are lost to time. Even the oldest civilizations of the galaxy don't fully understand it. All I know is that there's something unique about you, something that drew the crystal to you. And now we must protect you, or the galaxy will fall into chaos." Cal's expression darkened, but they didn't speak. They were still processing the gravity of what had happened, what they had become a part of. Zorath couldn't blame them. No child should bear the burden of such power. Yet here they were, caught in a conflict that would determine the fate of the galaxy. "We need to reach the sanctuary world," Zorath continued, his tone grim. "It's the only place I know where we can lay low. It's hidden from most of the galaxy. Even the Zarnak won't be able to track us there." Kale glanced at him, their voice barely a whisper. "Is it safe? Will we be able to hide there forever?" Zorath shook his head. "No, no place is safe forever. The Zarnak have long arms, and others will learn of the crystal. But the sanctuary is our best shot at getting the answers we need. There we'll be able to figure out how to use the crystal's power, or at least understand what it really means. We have no choice but to go there." As the ship continued its journey through the cold, endless expanse of space, Zorath couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. The sanctuary wasn't far, but every moment spent out in the open was a risk. He needed answers, and Kale needed to learn how to control the crystal before someone else could use it for their own ends. Hours passed in tense silence as the ship moved ever closer to their destination. But Zorath couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Zarnak might have been temporarily fooled, but they were relentless. They'd be back soon. And when they came, they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Suddenly, the ship's alarm blared, and Zorath's heart skipped a beat. The ship's scanners had picked up something. Something large. "Kale, stay in your seat," Zorath ordered, as he rushed to the control panel. His mind raced. It couldn't be a coincidence. The Zarnak had found them again. Or worse, someone else had. Kal's voice trembled from behind him. "What's happening? What do we do?" Zorath's fingers flew over the controls, trying to get a better reading on the incoming threat. The sensor data showed multiple ships, and they were coming in fast. There was no time to think. Zorath's instincts took over as he fired up the engines to full power, pushing the ship to maximum speed. "We're not out of the woods yet," Zorath said through gritted teeth. "Hold on tight." The ship jolted as it accelerated, but the unknown fleet was already on them, closing the gap faster than Zorath had anticipated. He had no doubt now. They were being hunted. But by whom? The Zarnak. Another force. It didn't matter. They had to escape, and Zorath would fight with everything he had to protect Kale. The ships behind them opened fire. Laser beams streaked through space, narrowly missing the ship as Zorath twisted and turned the controls to avoid their targeting systems. The ship rattled as the shields absorbed the hits, but he knew they wouldn't last long. They had to shake off the pursuers. "Kale," Zorath called, his voice tight with urgency. "The crystal. Focus on it again. We need its power." Kale's eyes widened with uncertainty, but their hands trembled as they touched the crystal once more. As they closed their eyes, Zorath could feel it. The pulse, the energy. For a moment, the ship seemed to resonate with the power of the crystal, vibrating in harmony with Kale's focused energy. Then, without warning, the crystal released a shockwave that blasted out through space. The ships pursuing them were caught off guard, their systems overloaded by the sudden burst of energy. Some of the ships veered off course, unable to recover from the crystal's force. The remaining few tried to regain their position, but Zorath had already pushed the ship into a risky maneuver, diving into an asteroid field. The surrounding rocks and debris created a maze of obstacles, making it nearly impossible for the pursuing ships to navigate without crashing into them. Zorath gritted his teeth and forced the ship through narrow gaps, praying that their shields would hold. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the enemy ships pulled back. Zorath let out a relieved breath. They had done it. Barely. The ship came to a halt, nestled between massive asteroids, hidden from sight. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a cold realization settled in Zorath's chest. They were not safe. The galaxy was aware of Kale and the crystal. They were being hunted by forces more powerful than they could imagine, and the battle for the crystal was only beginning. Zorath turned to Kale, who had slumped in their seat, exhausted from the use of the crystal's energy. "We'll make it," he said quietly. "We'll make it to the sanctuary. But we can't stop running. Not yet." The child nodded, their expression full of determination. They had won this battle. But the war was far from over. Suddenly, the ship shook violently. A blast of energy rocked them to the core, sending Zorath into the seat. The alarms blared once again, and the lights flickered as the shields absorbed the incoming fire. "We're under attack," Zorath barked, scrambling to regain control of the ship. "Kale, get to the weapons console. We need to return fire." Kale's eyes widened, but they nodded quickly and ran to the weapons panel. The ship rocked again, and Zorath felt his heart race. The new attackers were relentless, their weapons powerful and precise. They were closing in fast. As Kale began operating the weapons, Zorath fought to keep the ship on course, weaving through the asteroids to avoid direct hits. But it was no use. The enemy ships were too close now, and they were prepared for every evasive maneuver Zorath tried. "We need to get out of here," Kale shouted, their voice filled with panic. "I can't hold them off much longer." Zorath's thoughts raced. There was no escape. Not this time. They had one chance to turn the tide, and it was up to Kale to unlock the power of the crystal, fully and completely. "Kale, focus," Zorath yelled. "I know you can do it. This is the moment. Use the crystal's power to stop them." Kale's hands were shaking as they grasped the crystal once more. They closed their eyes, trying to center themselves, trying to connect with the ancient force inside the crystal. Zorath could feel the ship shaking under the pressure, the heat from the incoming blasts causing the hull to groan. For a moment, everything was still. The ship seemed to stop moving, and the universe seemed to hold its breath. Then, a surge of energy erupted from Kale, not from the crystal itself, but from within Kale's very being. It was a force so powerful, so primal, that the ship seemed to tremble with it. The attacking ships froze in place. Time itself seemed to stretch as the shockwave from the crystal expanded outward. Zorath watched in awe as the enemy fleet's ships, all advanced and powerful, were overwhelmed by the raw energy Kale had unleashed. The ships tried to fight it, tried to regain control, but it was useless. Kale's power had shattered their systems, rendering them inert. In a final, desperate attempt, The ships tried to fire, but their weapons fizzled and exploded in the airless void of space. The battle was over. Zorath stared at Kale in disbelief, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The child, the one he had sworn to protect, had just turned the tide of an intergalactic war, and they had done it alone. Kale collapsed onto the floor, exhausted from the strain of using the crystal's full power. Zorath rushed to their side, his heart pounding. "You did it," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "You saved us." Kal's eyes fluttered open, and they smiled weakly. I didn't know I could do that." Zorath helped them to their feet, the gravity of the situation sinking in. The crystal was more powerful than they had ever imagined. And now they had only one choice: to find a way to control it before it consumed them all. The galaxy had been forever changed, and Kel was at the center of it all.